Please join me in welcoming a true patriot, Ambassador John Sullivan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Alicia. I didn't realize that those types of activities that I might have engaged in 40 plus years ago with your brother would have been known to anyone, Guy. I'm glad there's a reason why we didn't have you in Moscow. You got to be able to keep secrets, Guy. If it's classified stuff, you can't have this out on Signal, right? Sorry, I couldn't resist. And look, I am a bipartisan critic on this. I was not happy with how former Secretary Clinton used her email. I am not happy with how the Secretary of Defense conducts his business. And from my perspective, the biggest problem of all is not so much necessarily this disclosure of a particular piece of information. It's the signal it sends. It's the lack of leadership. How do I, as an ambassador, keep my team, my colleagues, from taking an easy shortcut? I could send an email message that's not secure, or I could go back to my office and get on a secure system and send it. It's a pain in the neck. It's when the signal from the top is, we don't care, it filters down, and it's hard to counteract, particularly, and even in places like Moscow, which I want to talk to you about tonight. So it's a problem. It's been a problem for a while. There are many aspects to it. Happy to talk to you about that later if you're interested. Overclassification, things like that. But I became used to living in Moscow. Everything I said was known to the Russians, and it's an unusual way to live, right? I mean, I knew in a forum, unless I was in a secure space, so-called SCIF, inside the embassy, everything I said was known to them, and I knew they were listening. And I asked my predecessor, John Huntsman, what it was like living that way, and he said, you get used to it. And I thought, and you do. But to give you a sense of what life was like at the embassy, we had several rooms, facilities in the compound, in the chancery, that were secure, that we had some confidence that we could have conversations there and the Russians wouldn't be able to monitor. And one of them was dedicated as the so-called fight room. In the fight room, if family members were having a dispute, you laugh, but it's true. How do the Russians take advantage of people? Among the ways is they want compromat. They want something to use against an American, a family member, or a diplomat. Something that somebody says in a fight, in a heated moment, can be turned against them and against us. So we had a fight room at the embassy. We had pardon this digression, but it's part of my introduction about what a special, unusual place Moscow is to serve as an American. We have there are actually two sets of Moscow rules. You may have heard that expression. There's a printed notebook, pretty thick, classified, that lays out operating procedures for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that are different from every other U.S. facility, embassy, consulate, military post, for that matter, in the world, because of the counterintelligence environment in Moscow. The Russian government, the security services smother the U.S. Embassy. Everyone is followed wherever they go, from the youngest child leaving the embassy to the most senior diplomat. So we have Moscow rules, operating procedures that just lay out a system that we've come up with to try to protect our mission and our information. Then there are the informal Moscow rules about what happens. And my favorite one was, my favorite Moscow rule was that there are no coincidences. So the fellow who's behind you and sort of looking over your shoulder into your bag as you're at the checkout counter at the supermarket, who looks just like the guy who was sitting next to you at the movie theater 2 nights before, there are no coincidences. It makes a person paranoid. It does tend to wear on people over time. It's why we limit the tenure of any U.S. diplomat to 3 years or less, because of how the Russian government treats us and expels us at the rate they expel us. It's usually 2 years or less. But it requires the approval of the ambassador, and I would have to get the approval of the Secretary of State to let a diplomat stay, anyone stay, for more than 3 years, just because the stress, even if you don't realize it, the stress is so great, and trying to be as vigilant as we all were. So this isn't my usual introduction to my talk, pardon the digression, but I usually start off by introducing myself, in addition to what Alicia kindly said, to give you some background on me and why I have the nerve to stand up here and talk to you about Russia, about Putin, about his war in Ukraine. I am not a Russian scholar. I am not a historian of Russia. I do not speak the Russian language, but I am, and I wouldn't admit this until after I got confirmed and sent over to Moscow, I am an amateur Russophile. I've always been fascinated by Russia. It was my first trip outside of the northeastern United States as a young person, was to the Soviet Union in 1989 with my wife, Grace. It was not our honeymoon. I'm not like Bernie Sanders. It was not our honeymoon, but it was our first trip, international trip, after our honeymoon. We had 6 weeks. I dragged poor Grace across the Soviet Union. We went to Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev. We called it Kiev then, the Russian pronunciation, and Yalta. And in 1989, so late communist era under Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, the loosening of the Communist Party's grip on the Soviet peoples. So I've always been fascinated by it, and really it stems from, and it may sound odd to say, it stems from my interest in ice hockey. 1972, September. Anyone know what happened then? Summit Series. USSR, Soviet national team played Team Canada. And this was late summer of 72. The Bruins, I'm a Bostonian. The Bruins had won the Stanley Cup in May of 1972, and I was obsessed with all things involving the Bruins, ice, like most of us in the greater Boston area, and really a large chunk of New England. And this Soviet team fascinated, and how we in North America underestimated the Soviet national hockey team. I remember there was a famous, now long deceased, beat writer for the Boston Globe, Fran Rosa, who covered the Bruins. And I remember, and I read, this was, the Herald, the Globe, every day, sports sections covering the Bruins, Red Sox, etc. And the columns he was writing about the Soviet national team and saying things like, oh, this is going to be ugly, this series. I mean, do these Russians know? They're playing professionals. They're going to be playing players from the NHL. They could get hurt. Their equipment's shoddy. I mean, why are the NHL players even wasting their time? And it turned out that Soviet national team was pretty darn good. In fact, in many ways outplayed the Canadian team in the series. Canada wins the series in Game 8 in Moscow. But from my perspective as an amateur hockey observer, this Soviet team was better than Team Canada. Now you fast forward 8 years from that, February 1980 in Lake Placid, you get the picture. I mean, I was hooked on Soviet hockey. I could name, this stood me in good stead when I was ambassador. I could name to the average Russian, by most Russians, including in and around Moscow or St. Petersburg, are rabid hockey fans, like they are in Montreal or Toronto. I could name the lineups from the 72 Soviet team and the 80 team, and I would impress them, sort of an idiot savant for Soviet hockey. And they'd say, so I'd put my money where my mouth is. I'd be talking to them about hockey, about how much they admired Soviet hockey. But then I'd start talking about Valery Kharlamov, who was the leading scorer on the 72 team, and what a shame it was. pardon my apologies in advance to any Philadelphia Flyers fans here, that Bobby Clark, Philadelphia Flyers captain, playing for Team Canada, intentionally slashed Kharlamov in the ankle in Game 6, basically broke his ankle, took him out of the series. It probably had an influence in why Canada won. I'd tell the Russians stories like that, and they would just eat it up. Yes, Western perfidy. Those, they couldn't beat us fairly. They're doing us in. And Bobby Clark, and I'd turn that all to my advantage. I did a press conference once. I'd gone to a KHL game in Moscow just after I arrived, and I was with a person who became a friend of mine, Slava Fetisov, youngest captain of the Soviet national team, played on the 80 team, and a guy named Big Yak Yakushev, who played on the 72 team. And Big Yak was taciturn, didn't speak English, or said he didn't speak English. And the three of us sat together during this KHL game in Moscow, and I'm trying to talk, through Slava's interpretation, trying to talk to Big Yak, getting stories from him about the 72 series, and he's just not interested in the American ambassador. And I made the mistake of, trying to ingratiate myself with him, reminding him of what Bobby Clark did. And that just made him even more taciturn and angry, like, oh, you goddamn you. So then my State Department colleagues asked me to do a press conference after the game. And this was part of my idea, my bright idea of hockey diplomacy. So I'm standing between Slava and Big Yak to this swarm of Russian media in the arena right after this KHL game. And my State Department colleagues are in the back of the room. And they're looking at me, and I'm starting to give my stemwinder speech about how hockey unites us, North Americans, Americans and Russians, Canadians and Russians, Finns, Swedes, Czechs, you name it. It's a great game that, should bring us all together, not separate us. And I'm going on this riff. And I can see my State Department colleagues, and particularly our senior press officer, who's looking at me like, where is he going with this? And I'm like, it's the one thing that unites all hockey fans. I mean, it's one thing we can all agree on, and I keep saying this over and over again, and I'm looking at Big Yak. I say the one thing that unites all of us is, pardon the language, the Flyers suck. Big Yak gets a big grin on his face. There's a picture in my book where Big Yak is laughing. Slava is looking at me, and he starts laughing. He said Yak was a naturally taciturn guy. And he just thought that was great, that I, casting an aspersion on Bobby Clark, the villain. I went there with good intentions. I went there with an open mind. I didn't go there to pick a fight. I was Donald Trump's ambassador. I had served as Deputy Secretary of State for 2.5 years. I asked to go. I went to, John Huntsman came home from Moscow to tell the President and Secretary Pompeo that he was going to leave his post, and he met with me first before he walked down the hall to see the Secretary, and we talked about his plans. And that's when the thought occurred to me. This was June of 2019. At that point, I was 2.5 years in. It was and this is the Trump 45 administration, it was pretty hectic and chaotic, and I was on the hot seat and was starting to think about an exit strategy, and I didn't want to leave government service, but what else was I going to do? The Moscow Post comes open. So I asked Secretary Pompeo. He agreed to support me. He said I'd earned it. He spoke to the president on my behalf. And I write about this in my book. That's the summer of 2019. In August, the president had approved my nomination to go forward. And I was at a meeting at the White House. The president was there. I think he was meeting with the president of Romania. And the meeting broke, and we were walking out of the cabinet room, and the president walked by me, and he said, so you want to go to Russia, huh? And I said, yes, sir. And it became clear as he started asking me questions, he thought that Secretary Pompeo was forcing me out. He said, you want to leave Mahogany Row on the 7th floor at the State Department and go to Moscow? I'm like, yes, sir. Like, you sure? I'm like, yeah, no, I really do. And then he gave me one of those, like, you've got to be out of your mind. Looks like, why? I'm like, no, sir, I want to serve. He shook his head. He said, okay, and he walked off. And that was it. That's actually the last time I spoke to Donald Trump. It was August of 2019. Never spoke to him in the year I served as his ambassador in Moscow. But he wasn't the first president to tell me basically I was crazy for wanting to go to Moscow. I had President Biden a year and a half later tell me that I was crazy to want to stay there. So I'm making that bipartisan observation. But I went there with the following charge: to work with the Russians where we could, try to improve our relationship with them where we could, and to oppose them vigorously as necessary where we needed to, whether it was cyber attacks, wrongfully detained Americans, election interference, you name it. The list is long, and it was growing longer by the month, in 2019, 20, 21. I was kept, so I served for a year under President Trump, thought I would be done. President Biden asked me to stay. I believe I'm the only U.S. ambassador that Biden kept. So he asked me to stay as President Biden's ambassador, was honored to do it. And I say this to people, and they sometimes find it surprising. There wasn't a big difference substantively, at least back then, in U.S. policy toward Russia. There were some changes on substantive policy with respect to Russia, but for the most part, we continued a pretty hard program against the Russian Federation that had been supported by Congress, by senators like Marco Rubio, and by Secretary Pompeo, and by me. That continued. The biggest change was really more process and procedure, for those of you who are interested in how Washington works. I mentioned that I never spoke to President Trump when I was his ambassador. I rarely spoke to anyone at the White House. The NSC didn't really run much of a policy-making process, but I wasn't an unguided missile in Moscow. My instructions came from Secretary Pompeo, which isn't surprising. I'd been his deputy for almost 2 years. I served under Secretary Tillerson for 1 year, and then for almost 2 years under Secretary Pompeo. So I'd get my instruction from a pretty darn good source, the Secretary of State. And because I'd been deputy secretary, I didn't have to call back. I mean, it was one of the point that President Trump was trying to make was I went from being deputy secretary, the number 2 person in the bureaucracy, to being ambassador, which meant nominally in the bureaucracy, I reported to a deputy assistant secretary, who reported to an assistant secretary, who reported to an undersecretary, who reported to the deputy secretary. I didn't have to go through that. He'd call me, Pompeo, I'd call him. And that's how we did it for a year. And it worked well. It's not the way it's supposed to work. But as far as I was concerned, I felt confident in what I was doing, was consistent with the administration's program, and I had firm direction and as reliable as an instruction as an ambassador can get, if not from the president, then from the Secretary of State. That all switched with the Biden administration. I still have, consider him a friend, well, both Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Blinken. I knew Secretary Blinken well. I had succeeded him as deputy secretary from the Obama administration to the Trump 45 administration, but I didn't get my instructions from the secretary or from the department. I got my instructions from the White House, from the NSC, from Jake Sullivan, from his deputy, John Feiner. So that was the biggest change. Had a lot of, spoke to President Biden. It was much different procedurally. The substance of the policy, and we can talk about that. There were a few changes, but it wasn't a major sea shift in policy, but it was in process and who was running the show, and it was emphatically the White House and the NSC. One policy that didn't change, and you may find this a little surprising, was with respect to Ukraine. Among other things, both in the Trump administration and at the start of the Biden administration, Ukraine wasn't the highest priority in U.S. relations with Russia. I wasn't getting instructions regularly to go in to talk to the Russians, to tell them to make changes with how they were treating the government in Kyiv or the separatists in the Donbass, et cetera. That wasn't a high priority. I'll cite as an example for you, I went with President Biden to his meeting with President Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva. And I'd been home for a time before that meeting. I'd participated in preparation sessions with the president, and then was there when he met with Putin. It was a full day, most of the day, not a full day. It really wasn't as long as we had budgeted for the meetings. There were two meetings. One was 1+1, so the president and Secretary Blinken, Putin, and Foreign Minister Lavrov, really the two presidents talking, and then a slightly expanded meeting with, I came in, Jake Sullivan came in, and our counterparts on the Russian side. What did the two presidents not talk about? In June of 2021, Ukraine. They talked about everything else. Cyber, going both ways. The Russians complaining about cyber attacks by the United States on Russia, vice versa. Election interference, what the Russians would say we were doing in their sphere of influence, color revolutions, wrongfully detained Americans, the Arctic, Afghanistan. Biden spent more time talking to Putin about Afghanistan. Think about the timing now. This was midway through the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in June of 2021. It had been announced in the spring and was to be completed by September 11th. And what the United States was interested in at that point was, and in talking to the Russians about, was a base for our counterterrorism mission in Central Asia focused on Afghanistan. If we could get a base in Central Asia to replace everything we were losing in Afghanistan when we withdrew, starting with the enormous base we had at Baghdad. Biden is talking to Putin about Afghanistan. They hardly mentioned either one of them, Ukraine. Putin was very relaxed. He was in a jovial mood. I've met him a number of times. He was in a jovial mood, very relaxed. He was cracking jokes, sometimes subtly at President Biden. A couple of examples. When Biden said, when Biden raised the point of a base, would you not oppose the United States if we were able to get an agreement with the Kazakhs or the Tajiks, et cetera, some country to take a base for us, even a small footprint in Central Asia, we hope that you would not oppose it. And of course, Putin was adamantly opposed. There was no way he was going to agree to a U.S. military presence in Central Asia. But Putin said to him, seriously, he said, it translated, well, maybe we'll let you share our 201st base in Tajikistan. Now, for those of you who don't know, and no reason you should, the 201st base it's got that name because it's the number for the primary Russian, and this is in Tajikistan, Russian Federation military units, like the 101st Airborne Division. The 201st Guards Regiment is based there, but it's a much bigger, it's one of their largest bases outside of the Russian Federation. It's right on the border of Tajikistan with Afghanistan. This was a joke. And how do I know it was a joke? Because I'm sitting directly across the table from the then and still Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Gerasimov, not KGB trained, so he's the FSB. The FSB is the principal successor to the KGB. Keep the straight face, never reveal what you're thinking. General Gerasimov is sitting right across the table, and it was a narrow table for me, and Putin says, we'll let you share our 201st base, and Gerasimov literally gasps and goes, not KGB trained. It was a joke. It is a Putin-style joke. On our side, people had trouble, first of all, what's the 201st base? And what does this mean? Could he really be serious? Well, no, he wasn't serious. It was a joke. He told another joke. He's sort of a Slavic Archie Bunker. He's got, this is Putin. He's sitting next to his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who is, I believe it was his mother, was Armenian. Alicia and Guy will appreciate this. So Lavrov's from Armenia. And at this expanded bilat, the only people who spoke other than the two presidents were the secretary and the foreign minister. And at this point, Lavrov is talking to Biden about something, the Arctic, I can't remember what. And Putin puts his hand over Lavrov's mouth and says to Biden in a sotto voce sort of, be careful negotiating with him. He's Armenian. Like, he's going to pick your pocket. And so people on our side are like, what is going on? I say all this to you because this guy was as loose as you can imagine. He was not nervous. He knew what he was about. He was not there to talk to Biden about Ukraine, or really anything for that matter. And the final proof I'll offer for that is Biden and Putin then did press conferences after their summit meeting, and we didn't want them side by side, so Putin went first and then Biden. And at Putin's press conference, huge room like this, hundreds of media, Russian, international, American, and the first question was from Russian state media. I can't remember now which state media it was, Izvestia. So it's Russian state media, which means it's Putin asking himself a question. I mean, that's just what it is. And it was a woman got up from Izvestia and says, Mr. President, the most important issue to all Russians is Ukraine. What did you talk to Biden about concerning Ukraine? And Putin says, well, not much. Biden says he wants Ukraine to comply with the Minsk agreements, and we think that would be a good idea if they could get their vassals in Kyiv to do that. We're doubtful, but that was about it. And then President Biden came, and in his opening remarks, he listed, it was about a dozen things that he and Putin talked about. And it was either the 10th or the 11th in the list was Ukraine. So what happens right after that meeting? Putin writes, it got a lot of publicity at the time, as it was meant to, an article, a historical monograph going back to ancient Kievan Rus, through the Second World War, through Soviet days, etc. And the thrust of it was, Ukraine as a nation is a fiction. We're all Slavic sisters and brothers. There isn't really a distinction between Russia and Ukraine. So he's got this historical narrative going. The next month in August, when we have our debacle in Afghanistan, a week before, so on August 19th, the week before the terrorist attack at the international airport in Kabul, a very senior Russian security official, Nikolai Patrushev, who was the secretary of the Russian Security Council, sort of the Russian equivalent to Jake Sullivan at the time, gives an interview again in Russian state media, in Russian, but it's addressed to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And the thrust of the interview is, I have no idea why my Slavic sisters and brothers in Kiev are so enamored of the West and of NATO. Why do you want to be a member of NATO? You will never get anything from them. Look what the United States is doing to its major non-NATO ally in Kabul. After 20 years and a reason for their military to be there, they're cutting and running. You have much less claim to them. They will never support you. Why you're not embraced by, you do not embrace us in this great Russian thing of ours, this triune Rus, this Ruski Mir, is beyond me. Fast forward 2 months, the U.S. intelligence community gives an alert. I happen to be home on leave, that there had been a buildup in the spring of Russian troops in southwestern Russia, speculation that Putin was going to invade then in April or May of 2021. They didn't. But there was then a much larger increase starting in the early fall of 2021 with logistical preparations that no country would do unless it really was going to go to war. And I'm talking about building field hospitals, stacking blood plasma, in addition to ammo dumps, fuel dumps, et cetera. In the conclusion, the consensus, which is pretty unusual in the U.S. intelligence community, it's a pretty diverse group of views, the consensus was virtually absolute certainty that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And for the next 4 months, it was a matter of U.S. trying to engage in diplomacy and our NATO allies with Russia to stop that. But think about it. What changed between June of 2021 and October of 2021? Nothing. This had been in the works for a while. My conclusion is, long before Putin and Biden met in June of 2021, Putin knew what he was going to do in Ukraine. He was asked after the war started by state media, why did we wait? Why didn't we invade Ukraine after what happened in Crimea and the Donbass 2014, 15? Why didn't we invade in 16, 17? And Putin gave what for him is a pretty straightforward and I think accurate answer. He said, we weren't ready. He had to get ready. He had to get not only his military ready, but he had to strengthen as best he could his economy to withstand what they expected would be major Western sanctions if Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden sent the then CIA director, Bill Burns, to meet with Putin, Patrushev, the secretary of the Security Council, whom I mentioned, and other senior Russian leaders in early November. I went with him. I was home in Washington. I went with him to Moscow. And the message that Burns delivered was exactly that. Massive Western sanctions, unlike anything you saw after Crimea, after you went into the Donbass. Don't do it. It'll be disastrous for Russia and its people. And the response, particularly, I remember vividly Patrushev meeting with him in his office, and Patrushev looked at Bill and said, the sanctions that you hit us with in 2014, those were difficult for us to handle. We in the Russian Federation today, we're not the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. We're not 350 million people. We're much smaller. Our economy is a fraction the size of yours. So yeah, you can bring significant economic pressure to bear on us. But we've invested a lot in our military, and our military is as strong as yours. And we're not going to invade Ukraine, but if there's a problem in our neighborhood, we can handle it. Thank you very much. The message that Bill took back to the president, and I was with him on the plane flying back when he wrote a memo, was that we weren't 100% certain that, this is, again, early November of 21, that Putin was going to invade, but he was pretty darn close, and he was ready to do it. All that was necessary was the final go order, the decision by him to, yes, do it. The next several months, November, December, January, into February, up to February 24th, when the war started, on Thursday, February 24th, was a series of meetings, phone calls between U.S. leaders and Russian leaders, NATO and Russia, meetings at the OSCE in Vienna, and the Russians engaged in what I describe in my book as sham diplomacy. It was all done for show, to pretend that they were engaging with diplomacy to address what they described as an existential threat, the continuing existence of the Russian state, an existential threat posed to Russia by what the West was doing in Ukraine. And unless that was addressed, the Russians would have to take the appropriate actions to protect themselves. So, sham diplomacy, what do I mean by that? Here's an example. The Russians summoned me. We were summoned to the foreign ministry in mid-December, and I was handed 2 draft treaties, one purporting to be between the United States and Russia, and one between NATO and Russia. We hadn't asked for it. Putin, at the end of November, it was just after Thanksgiving, as I recall, gave a speech at the foreign ministry and said, you've got to get to the foreign minister himself and the Russian diplomats, you've got to get us security guarantees for our security against what's happening in Europe, and in particular what's happening in Ukraine. So they've come up with these 2 draft treaties, and they hand them to me. Here's where the sham diplomacy comes in. First, the 2 treaties, they're very short. These were not serious discussion drafts to engage in negotiations over topics like this. Back in the day before computers, when people dictated memos and letters, the old dictated but not read little notation at the bottom of a page to excuse typos, these were dictated but not read. And they were also only in Russian. The practice, the diplomatic practice is, when I, as U.S. ambassador, present a document on behalf of the United States, it's presented in our official language, English. As a courtesy, without fail, I would provide a copy translated into Russian. And the Russians would delight. They would waste enormous amounts of time when we were there to talk about something. They would go through our non-binding, unofficial courtesy translation and correct our grammatical mistakes. They would chuckle, ha ha ha, circle it in red. But that's the way business is done. They gave me these drafts in Russian. Why is that significant? Just deviating from diplomatic practice. They also said in handing them to me, we want to negotiate these drafts with you in 48 hours in Geneva. Now, they've handed them to me in Moscow. We want to negotiate these drafts with you in 48 hours in Geneva. And I said, do you know how long it's going to take for me to have these translated so that I can give them to the President and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense so that they can know what's in them? Quibbles, you're quibbling about this when war looms on the horizon, Mr. Ambassador? This is sham diplomacy. I said, what's the crisis? Why do you, it's 48, it's the continued existence of the Russian Federation. And oh, by the way, the threat to our continued existence is led by the United States. So we're heading down a path, Mr. Ambassador, that's going to lead us ultimately to, and this is what the Russians call the Cuban Missile Crisis. They call it the Caribbean Crisis. The Caribbean Crisis. This conversation just went from 0 to 60 in no time. You're talking about nuclear war now. Yep, if this confrontation, if this isn't resolved, you do the math. We've got nuclear weapons, you've got nuclear weapons. So, obviously gets a lot of attention in Washington, and my advice back to Washington was that by their hand doing this, creating a false sense of crisis when there was none, disrespecting us and the president by how they were doing it. I mean, they were basically saying, to bite. So we didn't meet 40, they said, if you don't come in 48 hours in Geneva, we're going to have a press conference and we're going to release these documents to the public and we'll show that you're not interested in negotiations and peace. I said, you got to do what you got to do. They did, the world shrugged. But I can give you example after example. They weren't serious. We'd sit in meetings. We would make our points. I would talk to them as I'm talking to you now without notes, to talk about specific issues involving Ukraine, the status of the Donbass, a federal solution, federalizing Ukraine, serious stuff. My Russian counterpart would have his notes that were cleared throughout the Russian system, and he would read his talking points. I would react to something he said, and he would never look up from his talking points. He would go back, and he'd find the one that was most relevant, maybe not completely relevant, but most relevant, so he wasn't embarrassed, and he'd reread it. There were no negotiations. Putin had already decided what he was going to do, and what he did was launched the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War. And the result has been almost 15 million Ukrainians killed, wounded, internally displaced, or rendered international refugees. Putin started the war. This wasn't a war that was started because of an existential threat to Russia. This was a choice by a government led by a president who had in his mind that this war was going to accomplish something that had been. I've got 2 minutes left before we start questions. I'll try to bring this plane in for a landing. Why did he do it? What's going on here? Why start this war? And why start this war? Because Putin has this, well, everybody's heard his, I'm sure you've heard his famous quote from years and years ago about when he first said the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's not the Holocaust. It's not even Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. No, in his mind, and I think he believes it, the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century is the demise of the Soviet Union. Why? It's not because he's a communist. He's not. I mean, he famously says on occasion, when talking about the old days, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to Soviet communism, you don't have a brain. I mean, it's hard to be the richest person in the world with $1 billion palace in Sochi and be a real, true Marxist-Leninist. So it's not communism. It's something bigger than that. It's this idea of the Ruski Mir and the Russian Empire, this imperial vision, goes back centuries, continues through Soviet days, and indeed the farthest expanse of the Russian Empire in the Soviet Union, extended by the Warsaw Pact into Eastern Europe. Losing that is the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and particularly for Russia. Why? The international boundary of the Soviet Union, 350 million people, much bigger than the Russian Federation is today. When the Soviet Union fell, that border went poof. The internal borders of the Soviet Union, separating the 15 Soviet republics, became, over time, independent nations, which separated, artificially, from Putin's perspective, the Russian people, his Slavic sisters and brothers. So Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, separated by an international borders. And that's what he considers, I mean, that's Russia in his mind. That's the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the Triune Rus, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. So there are echoes of the Second World War. Bear with me here. If you think about it, Germany's grievances in the interwar years growing out of Versailles, right? I mean, you take it even further, comparisons with Putin. Corporal Hitler maintained that the Imperial German Army didn't lose militarily the Great War, just as Lieutenant Colonel Putin in the KGB in Dresden says he and his fellow warriors for the Soviet state, they didn't lose the Cold War. It was the cowardly, weak-kneed communists like Gorbachev in Moscow who lost, just as the German imperial patriots after the Great War, so the great stab in the back in Berlin by the communists, the socialists, the Jews, etc. And what's the consequence? For Germany, loses all of its colonies and 10% of its European landmass, including what Hitler thought was the core heartland of Germany in the East Prussia. So there's now a phony border created by Versailles in the East. It creates the Danzig corridor and separates East Prussia, separates his Volk with this phony border growing out of a war that Germany didn't lose. And of course, he addresses that after a period of sham diplomacy and crises created by Berlin with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Think about Putin. Putin's got a phony border in the West created out of the demise of the Soviet Union in a war that he and his KGB comrades didn't lose. But the consequence of that, the surrender, particularly by the communists in Moscow, was creating a phony border in Russia's west that separates his Volk, his Russians, that separate Ukraine from Russia. And that's what he's erasing. It is a big deal. His war aims will not vary. They're to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. So it is an imperial quest that what it means for him to be a Russian and a Russian nationalist. It's that important to him. It's that important to him that he would take North Korean troops and military equipment to the dismay of his dear friend President Xi in Beijing, because he can't lose this war in Ukraine. He can never give up. He can't be like LBJ in 1968 after the Tet Offensive and say, sorry about that. I warned you, by the way, that I would do that. I gesticulate. I'm an Irishman, but I must have an Italian ancestry because I'm speaking with my hands here. LBJ after Tet says, holy smokes, I'm not going to run for re-election now. I got to devote my attention to the war. and I'm going to retire to the LBJ Ranch. Putin can't retire to Sochi. He wouldn't survive. So quickly, and then I'll turn to questions. This informs how I view what's going on between our negotiations with Moscow. The wave tops, I am not opposed to talking to the Russians. I am opposed to thinking, at least as Westerners think, of negotiating with the Russians. There is no negotiating with Putin over this war. We can tell him things. We should listen to what he tells us. But he will never surrender. He will never give up. He will never give up the tiniest piece of territory that the Russian military has seized during the course of the special military operation. And we can talk about that. I've got views about how his war aims have changed a little bit over time, and the territory seized because of the immense cost that he hadn't anticipated. Maybe when the war started, if he thought he could have subjugated Kyiv and created, Belarus and Russia have what they call a union state. Moscow dominates Minsk. If he could have added Ukraine to that union state, dominate Kyiv, get rid of Zelensky, control Ukraine, and not have to invade and seize territory, I bet he would have taken that bargain before the war started. After the war started, after the Russians lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed and wounded, he will never surrender an inch of that territory that it took Russian blood and treasure to seize. It's a huge problem for the United States, and the problem, as bloody and as gory as the war in Ukraine is, and as much as I support Ukraine and its fight for freedom and to be free from the domination of Moscow. What Putin wants is domination. They call it in Russia the center. That's Moscow. As much as I am in favor of that and support for Ukraine, from my perspective as an American, this is bigger than that. This is about Russia, and Russia in the United States and Russia in the world. We can't have a government in Moscow that does this and is simply accepted back into the G7 to become now the G8. Back into the why, in my opinion, given the brutality of the war that they've waged, Russian government officials, not the Russian people, not Russians individually, but why the Russian government is accepted in polite society is beyond me. So, questions?
Thank you. We're going to take some questions now. Start here.
I'm sorry about that, Tara. I told you I'd do it.
I don't know what you're willing or able to say, so I'll be very neutral. How would you characterize President Trump in the last 100 days in his approach to Russia,
Ukraine, yeah.
Ukraine, and our European allies?
I think, so there is a real schizophrenia within the administration, and I have seen, putting Trump to one side, but within the administration, there's some real flailing going on. This is my own view. I am not advising the administration in an unofficial or official capacity, but still maintain relationships. I can't tell you how many people I know who think, my God, this is crazy. And, it's embarrassing to some how Russia has strung the administration along, Putin has, over these 100 days. And, the Ukrainians agreed to, when Trump asked for it, an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And the Russians said no. Now, they said no by saying, conditions said, we want a ceasefire, but, and it's just, it is, having spent as many years as I have dealing with the Russians, it's classic obfuscation by them. He is never going to compromise. He's now suggested a 3-day ceasefire on May, I think it's either 7, 8, 9, 8, 9, 10, to correspond to their celebration of what they call Victory Day in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. It ties into his historical narrative about what Ukraine is and isn't. So there's a struggle going on within the administration. I don't know whether I can't predict what, and something may have happened this afternoon, pardon me if I've missed a tweet. It was one of the reasons why I wanted to leave as deputy secretary. You just never knew from one day or 1 hour to the next when everything you'd been working on for 2 hours suddenly went up in smoke because there was a tweet that removed the not from the sentence. The United States will not withdraw from, and like, oop, you just never know. But Trump also doesn't like to lose, and he doesn't want to be portrayed as somebody who was played by Putin. There is still, despite what they say publicly, Aaron, there are not a lot of profiles in courage. There are a few Republican members, senators and members, who are saying things critical of how the administration has handled the Russian negotiations. But I know for a fact that there are many more who disagree but won't say so publicly. Will Trump just walk away from it all? That's probably the negotiations. That's probably, I would think, the most likely, because I think he's misinformed in a number of things. One of them being the ability of Ukraine to continue to resist. He's bought the Russian line that their victory is inevitable and going to come soon, and that's just not so. I don't have a background in the military, but I know from my experience there when the war started how we in the United States underestimated the Ukrainians' both will and ability to resist. Now, over 3 years, they have grown their domestic capacity to arm themselves. Almost 50% of the weapons they use now are domestically produced, and particularly drones. And the biggest thing is they will not surrender. When Trump says that, we, the United States, and we can debate why this is wrong, the United States will recognize the Russian absorption of Crimea, not only as a matter of fact, but as a matter of law, Zelensky can't agree to that. He wouldn't remain as president. That is extremely unpopular among the vast majority of Ukrainians. They don't want to quit. They won't quit. The war is terrible. I've seen, I had access to the intelligence. I saw, evidence of the massacre in Bucha, what happened in Mariupol in April and May of 22. Mariupol was this beautiful city on the Sea of Azov. And after it was under siege by the Russians, Mariupol looked like Stalingrad in January 1943. I mean, this is horrific, and this is being done to the Ukrainians themselves. So, of all the peoples in the world who want this war to end, it's the Ukrainians. But the war's been done to them in the most brutal way you can imagine. And so what Trump doesn't understand is when he's berating Zelensky, and we can criticize Zelensky, I've criticized Zelensky, but not his courage and not his patriotism and not his heroism in staying in Kyiv when everyone from the president on down, President of the United States, thought that he was a dead man or he was going to have to flee. And you take a man like that and seat him in the Oval Office and talk to him the way our president or vice president did. He's been through so much in 3 years, stress, the threats to his life. His hometown is attacked regularly, people slaughtered by Russian missiles. The stress this guy's under for 3 years, I cut him some slack, and the Ukrainian people won't let him surrender. And Putin is so among the mistakes I think that the president is making is accepting the Russian argument that the Russians can go on forever doing this and they're inevitably going to win, and that's just not so. The Russians thought they were going to win in 2 weeks in March of 2022. They haven't been good predictors in the past, and they are not supermen. They talk about the victory of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War, but that was a victory of the Soviet Union, and this is another thing that infuriates Ukrainians. It was a victory of the Soviet Union, the Red Army. It wasn't the Russian Federation. Per capita, there were more casualties in Belarus first, Ukraine second, than in Russia during the Second World War. Per capita, and it may be coming close to even just on a pure numerical basis, more heroes of the Soviet Union for bravery in the Great Patriotic War awarded to Ukrainians than to Russians. So for Putin to hijack the narrative about the Second World War and to call the Ukrainians Nazis when the Ukrainians, per capita, sacrificed as much as or more than the Russians did. That story is just not seeping into the White House, and some people are just not listening. I don't believe that Mr. Witkoff gets a lot of briefings on Putin, on Russia, on Putin's war aims. I'll tell you, when I was in Moscow, among the reasons why I speak maybe with overconfidence, but it's born of a lot of time spent studying Putin and Russia for the following reason. I got there as ambassador just before the pandemic started. I spent 13 months isolated there. All of my public engagements canceled. We were only dealing with the Russians by phone, or occasionally if they were angry with us, we would have to send them a fax. We had some old agreements that provided for notice by facsimile, signed in 1993. And if they were really angry with us, they'd make us send them a fax. So we'd have to dust off the fax machine and send them a fax. But I lived in the station. So the station is the CIA headquarters, which is publicly acknowledged. There's a station chief, the head of the station, senior CIA, senior intelligence officer, career officer is our station chief. I lived up there all day. I got a graduate degree in Putin and Russia from our intelligence community. I was fascinated by it, and it was a real learning experience. In addition to being there on the ground and engaging with them, to then be able to go back to the embassy and just read. My nickname was the aardvark, because they said I would scoop up, I don't know how aardvarks feed, but I was scooping up all this paper. I was making them print things out for me. I spent a year and a half getting a graduate degree in Putin and his government. So I have a lot of confidence, both from what I saw and what I've learned. And my concern is that some of the people who are now representing the United States and negotiating with Putin and his senior officials just don't have the faintest idea what they're dealing with.
Ambassador, the United States has sanctioned Russia since 2012. We have increased our sanctions in 2022, 2023, and in November 2024. The G7 nations put some Russian price caps in 2024. How do you think, given the economic conditions in Russia, that has affected Russian behavior, if at all?
So if you mean government behavior, people ask me this all the time, were the sanctions effective? Did they stop the war to cure Putin or cause him? I mean, that's the answer to that's obvious, no. It's had a dramatic impact on the Russian economy. Inflation today in the Russian Federation is double digits. The prime rate set by the Central Bank of Russia is over 20%. It's at 21%. The Russian economy has been put on a war footing. The reason that inflation is so high, their manufacturing base is on overdrive to support their war economy. Almost 50% of their budget is for the military or the security services. It's somewhere between 45, 46%. How long this can continue to go on, we can debate. How much the average Russian probably hasn't felt the sting, apart from those who've lost relatives. Among the reasons that the budget is and the inflation is so high is the massive payments that they're making to the families of those who've been killed in the special military operation. There was a study late last year, I don't know how people got access to these records, but showing how bank accounts in remote Russian towns and villages that lost a disproportionate number of people who came from there in the special military operation, that cash inflows in a remote, in a Siberian village, a few rubles goes a long way. I mean, it's had a, so the war has permeated the Russian economy. And there are many who think that Putin is now dependent on this war, the nationalism that is created, to solidify and keep his hold on the country. And of course, I've left out the biggest enablers, principally in Beijing, but in other countries around the world. If, as the United States tried in 2022, when in the United Nations, in the United Nations General Assembly, you may recall, my colleagues at U.S. UN had a resolution approved by, I think it was either 141 or 143 countries that, and this was the language used, deplored and condemned the special military operation and demanded that Russia withdraw from Ukraine. And there were only, I think there were a handful of countries that voted against it. Russia, Belarus, I think even the Cubans may have abstained. There were a bunch of countries that abstained. It gave hope that the world was going to recognize what Putin had done, and unite in a way, and the analogy I'll draw is to 1990, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and everyone associates Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm with President George H.W. Bush, and rightfully so, 500,000 U.S. troops going to the Gulf, protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, expelling Iraq from Kuwait. What people forget is that military action by the United States, a coalition of 37 countries, was approved by the UN Security Council. The Soviet Union still held its seat. It voted for twice, at least twice, authorized military force to expel Iraq from Kuwait. The PRC abstained. It used to be that the world united against, under the old rules-based international order. There were occasions, maybe it was a brief period when history ended in 1990-91, but the world reacted hostilely when one country with brute force took over another country to absorb it, which is what Putin did with Ukraine. And that's the biggest failure. That's why Russia has survived. Russia's survived because the BRICS, the Global South, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, principally the PRC, but they've also been enabled by Tehran and Pyongyang. They have continued to support Russia. India, China, buying Russian oil, China buying Russian gas. That's why Russia has survived. U.S. diplomacy failed. U.S. diplomacy failed to deter Putin. U.S. diplomacy failed to unite the rest of the world with the West to oppose.
We could keep you here all night, John. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it, everybody. Bolshoi spasiba. Should we invite Ambassador Sullivan back in another 6 months for an update? I just want to say, if you enjoyed this evening's program, we have Ari Fleischer coming to talk to us a little more about politics. He's coming on June 4th, so please sign up and register for that. There's an enormous number of fantastic programs that we have coming your way, including an evening with Nick Calloway and Sean McManus, former president of CBS Sports, to talk about golf legend Eli Calloway. That's coming up this week, Thursday night. And also, I just want to say also a Bolshoi spasiba, which means big thank you to all of you for being here. We do this programming to serve the community, and we do it with the grace of your generous contributions to our annual fund. Thank you so much for all of the donors in the room. If you haven't had a chance to make your annual fund gift, we have a fantastic $100,000 board match happening at the moment. So this is an opportune moment to really support the library and programming. If anyone has any thoughts on our programming and ideas, please reach out to me, Ellen Cravato, or any one of our staff that are here tonight. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sullivan.